What if I told you that the most important words ever spoken in the history of humanity never reached you? Think about it. You grew up hearing about the Last Supper. That image is engraved in your mind. Jesus surrounded by the 12 apostles, the bread being broken, the wine being shared. You know the words, "Take and eat, this is my body. Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood." But what if I revealed to you that there's much more than that? That on that night in an upper room in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, words were spoken, teachings were shared, mysteries were revealed, and deliberately left out of the texts that reached your hands. I'm not talking about unfounded conspiracy theories. I'm talking about historical documentation, ancient manuscripts discovered by archaeologists, texts preserved in forgotten languages and unearthed from remote deserts. I'm talking about academic evidence that serious scholars have been analyzing for decades, but which remains unknown to most people sitting in church pews every Sunday. The question that won't go away is, why? Why were certain words preserved and others not? Why did some Gospels enter the Bible and others were left out? And more importantly, what do these lost words reveal about the true teaching of Jesus? For centuries, entire generations of Christians believed they possessed the complete account of that sacred night. But modern textual studies, archaeological discoveries, and linguistic analyses of the oldest manuscripts tell a different story, a story of selection, of editing, of human decisions about what should or should not be preserved. And here's what really matters. These absent words are not unimportant details. They touch on the heart of the deepest questions of human existence. They speak about equality, about the role of women in the early Christian movement, about mystical, direct experiences with the divine, about power versus service, about hierarchy versus communion. In the next few minutes, you're going to embark on a historical journey that could completely transform your understanding of that sacred moment. I'm not going to make anything up. I'm not going to speculate without basis. I'm going to show you what real manuscripts say, what scholars have discovered, what ancient traditions preserved. You'll learn about texts that were excluded from the Bible, not because they were false, but because they told a story that certain religious leaders preferred you didn't know. You'll understand the political and human process behind the formation of the Bible as we know it today. And you'll discover that the search for spiritual truth doesn't need to destroy your faith. On the contrary, it can deepen it in ways you never imagined. But I need to give you a warning. What you're about to discover may be uncomfortable. It may challenge beliefs you've carried since childhood. It may make you question authorities you've always considered absolute. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He questioned. He challenged. He invited people to think, to search, to not simply accept what they were told. So take a deep breath, open your mind, and join me in this investigation into the lost words of the Last Supper, words that may be more alive and relevant today than they ever were. To understand what was erased, we first need to deeply comprehend what happened that night. And here's something that might surprise you. The Last Supper was not a Christian invention. It was an ancient Jewish celebration. Jesus was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. And on that Thursday night, on the eve of the crucifixion, they weren't doing something new. They were participating in one of the oldest and most sacred rituals of Judaism, Passover, or Pesach. Imagine the scene with me. Jerusalem is overflowing with pilgrims. It's estimated that the city's population increased tenfold during Passover. The streets are full, the air heavy with incense, and the aroma of lambs being roasted. Every Jewish family is preparing their own celebration of liberation from Egypt, reenacting the last meal before the Exodus. The Jewish Passover meal is not an ordinary meal. It's a complex ritual, loaded with symbols. Every food on the table tells a story. The unleavened bread represents the haste of liberation. There was no time for bread to rise before fleeing slavery. The bitter herbs symbolize suffering in Egypt. The wine represents joy, freedom, the divine promise. And here's the crucial detail. During this meal, there are specific moments for teaching. The leader of the supper, in this case Jesus, has the role of explaining the symbols, telling the story of liberation, connecting the past with the present. It's a moment of oral transmission of wisdom, tradition, mystery. Studies on first-century Jewish practices reveal that these celebrations could last for hours. It wasn't a quick meal. It was an immersive experience, full of prayers, songs, theological discussions, rabbinic teachings. Participants reclined on couches, a posture that symbolized freedom since slaves ate standing up. Now, when you read the Gospels, you notice something intriguing. They offer surprisingly brief accounts of what, in reality, must have been an experience of several hours. Matthew dedicates only 4 verses to Jesus' words about the bread and wine. Mark, even less. Luke is a bit more extensive. And John is completely different. In the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't even mention the bread and wine in the traditional way. Instead, John dedicates 5 entire chapters, chapters 13 through 17, to Jesus' words that night. 5 chapters. That represents about 15% of John's entire Gospel, dedicated exclusively to what Jesus said and did during the Last Supper. So we have a historical puzzle. Either Jesus said only the few words recorded in Matthew and Mark, or he said much, much more, and most of it was omitted. Textual analyses and comparative studies strongly suggest the second option. Ancient manuscripts of the Gospels, when compared side by side, reveal variations. I'm not talking about different translations, I'm talking about the original Greek texts. Small differences in the exact words, in the order of phrases, in details that were included in one version, but not in another. These variations are not errors, they're clues. They're evidence that different early Christian communities preserved different aspects of that sacred event. Academic research on oral tradition in first-century Judaism demonstrates that teachers like Jesus didn't teach only through single declarations. They repeated, reformulated, adapted their teachings for different audiences and contexts. The very structure of the Passover celebration invited this. It was a moment of extensive teaching, not brief pronouncements. And here's where the story gets even more fascinating. In the early years after the crucifixion, before any gospel was written, these teachings circulated orally. Early Christian communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire shared memories, repeated stories, preserved Jesus' words. And not all of these communities preserved exactly the same things. When the Gospels finally began to be written, decades after the events, each author made choices about what to include, what to emphasize, what to leave out. These choices were influenced by the needs of their specific communities, by the theological questions they faced, by the challenges their readers were experiencing. So, when you realize that the Last Supper was a celebration lasting hours, filled with deep Jewish symbolism, conducted by a teacher who regularly taught through long discourses, you begin to understand that those few verses in the Gospels cannot be the complete story. And this leads us to the inevitable question: what else did Jesus say? What other teachings were shared on that sacred night? And why did certain communities preserve memories that others did not preserve? Before revealing those answers, I need to extend an invitation to you. This isn't just about watching videos, but about participating in a collective awakening. If you're sensing that there's a depth to the Christian message that goes beyond what's normally taught, if you're seeking a richer and more historically grounded understanding of your faith, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because every revelation here is built with historical responsibility and spiritual respect. We're not going to invent mysteries. We're going to explore the real mysteries that history and archaeology reveal to us. Join this community of truth seekers. Now let's do something few Christians have ever done. We're going to place the 4 accounts of the Last Supper side by side and carefully observe the differences. And prepare yourself, because what you're going to discover might surprise you. Let's begin with Matthew 26:26-29. The account is straightforward and concise. During the meal, Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and distributes it, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he takes the cup, gives thanks, and says, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." He then adds that he will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when he drinks it new in the kingdom of God. Total 4 verses. Mark 14:22-25 is almost identical, with small linguistic variations. The essential words are the same: body, blood, covenant, kingdom. Mark also dedicates only 4 verses. It's interesting to note that scholars believe Mark was written first, and that Matthew possibly used Mark as a source, which would explain the similarity. But when we get to Luke 22:14-20, things start to get interesting. Luke includes details the others don't mention. He records Jesus saying, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This phrase reveals emotion, anticipation, deep desire. Luke also presents a slightly different order. In his version, Jesus mentions the cup, then the bread, then the cup again. Some ancient manuscripts of Luke even present shorter versions, omitting parts of these verses, which raises questions about what exactly was in the original text. And then we come to John, and John changes everything completely. In the Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 17, there's no mention of the traditional words about the bread and wine. Nothing about "this is my body" or "this is my blood." Instead, John dedicates an enormous space to something totally different: Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and then an extensive, profound, mystical discourse that occupies 5 entire chapters. Think about the significance of this for a moment. The first 3 Gospels, called synoptic because they follow a similar view, focus on the words about bread and wine. John completely ignores that part and concentrates on teachings about love, unity, persecution, the Holy Spirit, the vine and the branches, the nature of truth, prayers for the unity of believers. How do we explain this dramatic difference? Academic analyses suggest some fascinating possibilities. Perhaps John was writing for a community that already knew the tradition of bread and wine well, so he chose to preserve other teachings from that night that weren't widely known. Perhaps he wanted to emphasize more mystical and spiritual aspects instead of ritual elements. Or, and this is the possibility that really matters to us here, perhaps John was preserving a different oral tradition, memories of words that really were spoken that night, but which were omitted by the other evangelists. Studies on the formation of the Gospels reveal that each author had access to different sources. Matthew and Luke probably used Mark, but also had access to another source of Jesus' teachings that scholars call the Q source, from the German Quell, meaning source. John seems to have had access to completely independent traditions. What does this tell us? That from the beginning, different Christian communities preserved different memories of that night, and that the Gospel authors made conscious choices about what to include in their limited texts. Papyrus was expensive, scrolls had limited size, not everything could be included. But here's the crucial question. If we have these variations even within the texts that were accepted into the Bible, what does that say about texts that were not included? If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John can present such different accounts of the same night, what other versions, other teachings, other words might have been preserved in Christian communities whose texts weren't included in the final canon? The answer, as you're about to discover, is many, many other words, many other teachings. And some of those words were deliberately excluded, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient for the power structures that were forming in the institutional church. Texts were found, manuscripts were unearthed, and they tell a broader, richer, and in some ways more challenging story than the simplified version that reached us. But before we dive into these lost texts, we need to understand something fundamental: how these words were transmitted in the early years of Christianity before any gospel was written. And that's what we're going to explore now. Here's something that might completely change your perspective. When Jesus died, there was no Christian Bible. There was no New Testament. There were no written Gospels. There were only memories, stories, words transmitted from mouth to mouth. The oldest Gospel, probably Mark, wasn't written until about 40 years after the crucifixion. 40 years. Think about that. An entire generation of Christians lived, worshipped, suffered persecution, and died without ever reading a single word about Jesus. Everything they knew came from oral tradition. And oral tradition in the ancient world wasn't like the telephone game we know today, where the message distorts with each repetition. Anthropological studies on oral tradition cultures demonstrate that these societies developed sophisticated memorization techniques. In first-century Judaism, teachers and disciples dedicated entire years to memorizing sacred texts, rabbinic teachings, interpretations of the Torah. Jesus taught for 3 years, 3 years of discourses, parables, debates, public and private teachings. The Gospels preserve only a fraction of that material. John himself admits this at the end of his Gospel. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So what happened to all that unwritten material? It circulated. It was shared. It was preserved in the memories of the early Christian communities. Ancient texts of the Church Fathers, Christian leaders of the first centuries occasionally make reference to words of the Lord that don't appear in any of the canonical Gospels. These are called agrapha, literally unwritten things. They're quotations attributed to Jesus that were preserved outside the Gospels. Some of these agrapha are found in letters of early Christian leaders. For example, a famous quotation preserved in the Acts of the Apostles, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." These words are attributed to Jesus, but don't appear in any Gospel. Paul knew this oral tradition and shared it. Research on early Christian communities reveals a surprising diversity of practices and beliefs. There were Jewish Christians who maintained Mosaic law. There were Gentile Christians who rejected Jewish practices. There were communities that emphasized mystical visions. Others focused on ethical teachings. Some recognized female leadership. Others were more patriarchal. And each of these communities preserved memories of Jesus that were relevant to their own situations. A community facing persecution would preserve teachings about suffering and resistance. A community dealing with internal conflicts would focus on words about unity and forgiveness. A community exploring mystical experiences would guard teachings about union with the divine. Now here's where this becomes crucial to our theme. The Last Supper wasn't just about bread and wine. It was Jesus' farewell moment, his last hours with the disciples before arrest. It's reasonable to suppose that he would have said much more than the few phrases preserved in the Synoptic Gospels. Some oral traditions suggest that Jesus spoke extensively about the future of the community. Others preserve memories of teachings about the role of women. After all, scholars believe that women may have been present at the Last Supper, although this is generally minimized in traditional artistic and theological representations. Linguistic analyses of the Gospels show that certain teachings have characteristics of carefully preserved oral tradition, poetic patterns, parallelisms, mnemonic structures that facilitated memorization. These are signs that material was transmitted orally before being written. But here's the uncomfortable question. Not all oral traditions were eventually written down, and of those that were written, not all were included in the Bible. There was a process of selection, of filtering, of deciding what was orthodox and what was not. This process didn't happen all at once. It was gradual. Over the first centuries, as the institutional church consolidated, certain versions of events became official while others were marginalized. Texts that supported the emerging authority structure were preserved. Texts that challenged that structure were questioned. And here's what's truly fascinating. Some of these marginalized texts still survived. They were secretly copied, hidden, buried, and in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered them. They discovered texts that preserve oral traditions different from those in the canonical Gospels. Texts that include words attributed to Jesus that never appeared in the Bible. Texts that suggest the Last Supper included teachings about equality, about direct access to the divine without intermediaries, about feminine spiritual authority. These texts were labeled apocryphal or heretical, but that's a perspective of victors writing history. From the point of view of the communities that preserved these texts, they were as sacred and authentic as any canonical gospel. So here's the question that needs to bother you. If valid oral traditions were deliberately left out of the Bible, what else don't you know about what Jesus really taught? And more importantly, are you willing to seek these lost truths, even if they challenge what you've always been taught? If you're on this journey with me, if you're sensing that there's a deeper layer of truth waiting to be discovered, write in the comments, "I seek the complete truth." I want to know how many of us are really ready for this honest investigation, without fear of questioning, without fear of discovering that the story is more complex than it seems. Let's create a community of intellectual courage and spiritual curiosity. Now let's talk about one of the most decisive moments in the history of Christianity, a moment that forever changed which texts you would read and which would never reach you. Year 325 AD. Almost 3 centuries after the crucifixion, Emperor Constantine, newly converted to Christianity, convenes bishops from throughout the empire to the city of Nicaea, in present-day Turkey. The official objective? To resolve theological controversies, especially about the nature of Christ. But what really happened there had much broader consequences. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you need to comprehend the context. During the first 3 centuries, Christianity was not a unified religion. It was a diverse, decentralized movement. With dozens of communities practicing variations of the faith, there were Christians who considered Jesus completely human, others completely divine. Some believed in both simultaneously. There were groups that valued direct mystical experiences. Others emphasized doctrine and hierarchy, and each of these groups had their own sacred texts. Gospels that told Jesus' story in slightly different ways. Letters from different leaders, apocalypses, theological treatises, accounts of miracles, teachings preserved by specific communities. But now, Christianity was becoming the religion of the empire. And empires need uniformity. They need a single set of beliefs that everyone must accept. They need orthodoxy. The Council of Nicaea was not primarily about which books should be in the Bible. That process of official canonization would take longer, but it was the beginning of standardization. It was when political power united with religious power to decide, this is the correct version of Christianity. Everything else is heresy. Historical documentation from this period reveals heated debates. Bishops fiercely disagreeing about divine nature, about reliable texts, about acceptable practices. But in the end, one version won, not necessarily because it was truer, but because it had more political support. And here's what that meant in practice. Texts that supported the winning version were copied, preserved, distributed. Texts that contradicted that version were discarded. Not all immediately, but gradually. Over centuries, they disappeared. They stopped being copied. They were actively destroyed. Entire libraries were burned. Criteria were established to decide which texts were authentic and which were not. A text was considered reliable if it was attributed to a direct apostle, was widely used in important communities, didn't contradict the doctrine being standardized. Note that none of these criteria are about objective historical truth. They're criteria about authority and conformity. Historical studies of this period show that many texts that were excluded were known and respected by Christian communities for centuries. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, may have been written as early as the canonical Gospels, perhaps even earlier, but it was excluded. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene preserves teachings that portray a woman as a spiritual leader. It was excluded. Why? Some reasons were genuinely theological. Certain texts contained ideas that Christian leaders considered problematic, but some reasons were political and social. Texts that suggested feminine spiritual authority threatened emerging patriarchal structures. Texts that emphasized direct mystical experience threatened the authority of bishops and priests as necessary intermediaries. The political influence in the process was significant. Constantine was not a theologian. He was an emperor concerned with unity and control. He needed Christianity to be a unifying force in his empire, not a source of division. So he supported standardization, even if it meant silencing dissenting voices. Now it's important to be fair and balanced here. There were genuine reasons for some level of standardization. With so many different versions of Christianity circulating, some really did contain problematic or distorted ideas. There were texts that were clearly invented late, without real connection to Jesus' original teachings. The canonization process was not completely arbitrary or malicious, but, and this is a significant but, the process also was not divine or infallible. It was deeply human. It involved politics, power, cultural preferences, limitations of knowledge. Fallible men made decisions about which texts to contain and which to eliminate. And some of these decisions had more to do with control than with truth. Modern academic perspectives recognize this complexity. The formation of the Bible was necessary to preserve a central tradition, but also resulted in loss of diversity, loss of alternative voices, loss of teachings that could have enriched the Christian faith. And here's where we return to the Last Supper. If entire texts that were valued by early Christian communities were excluded from the Bible, what does that say about fragments of teachings within those texts? What does that say about words attributed to Jesus on that sacred night that were preserved in non-canonical Gospels? The inevitable answer is, these words were silenced not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the narrative being constructed. They were erased not by history, but by deliberate human choice. And in the following centuries, the memory of these texts disappeared almost completely. Generations of Christians grew up without knowing that other versions of Jesus' teachings ever existed. Until the 20th century. until archaeological discoveries began to reveal what had been hidden. Texts buried in ceramic jars in remote deserts, manuscripts preserved in ancient languages, entire libraries of early Christian texts that survived because someone long ago hid them before they could be destroyed. These texts are accessible now. They've been translated, studied, and they tell a different story, a broader story, of the Last Supper and Jesus' teachings. It's to these texts that we now turn our attention. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover will drastically expand your understanding of what Jesus may have really said on that crucial night. The word apocryphal carries weight. For many, it sounds like false or heretical. But academically, the apocryphal simply means hidden or secret. These were texts that circulated among early Christian communities, but which were not included in the official biblical canon. And here's what few know. Some of these texts are as old as the canonical Gospels. They were written in the same regions, by the same communities, with the same care and reverence. The only real difference is that they lost the political battle of canonization. Let's explore some of these texts and what they reveal about words that may have been spoken at the Last Supper. Let's begin with the Gospel of Thomas. Discovered in 1945 in Egypt as part of the Nag Hammadi Library, this text contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. It's not a narrative like the canonical Gospels. It's a collection of teachings. Scholars debate its dating, but some argue it may preserve traditions as old as any canonical Gospel. What's fascinating about Thomas is its focus on inner knowledge and direct mystical experience. One of the most famous sayings recorded in it, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known and you will understand that you are sons of the living Father." This kind of teaching about inner discovery, about direct access to the divine without intermediaries, is exactly the type of message that would be shared in an intimate moment like the Last Supper. And in fact, comparative studies show parallels between some sayings in Thomas and elements of the farewell discourse in John. Another important text is the Gospel of Philip, also discovered at Nag Hammadi. Philip contains reflections on the sacraments, including the Eucharist. It presents profound symbolic interpretations of the meaning of bread and wine, suggesting that these elements represent not just physical body and blood, but mystical union with the divine. Philip preserves a tradition that interprets the Last Supper as a moment of initiation into profound spiritual mysteries. One passage suggests that those who truly participate in communion transcend death, not physically, but spiritually. This is a mystical interpretation that goes beyond common literal understanding. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is particularly significant when we think about the Last Supper. Although it doesn't describe the supper specifically, this text preserves Jesus' teachings about spiritual vision and the nature of reality. And crucially, it presents Mary Magdalene as a receiver of special teachings that she shares with other disciples. Here's why this matters. If Mary received special teachings from Jesus, and if, as many scholars now believe, women were present at the Last Supper, then words were spoken that night that were preserved in traditions associated with female disciples, not just the 12 men. These traditions were systematically minimized or eliminated as Christianity became more patriarchal. Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi present a vision of early Christianity that is very different from later orthodoxy. In these texts, Jesus is presented as a teacher of secret wisdom, revealing mysteries of the heavenly kingdom. The Last Supper, in this context, would have been a moment of revelation of mysteries, not just an institution of ritual. It's important to emphasize, these texts are not uniformly reliable as history. Some contain ideas that developed well after Jesus' time, some mixed Christian teachings with Greek philosophies or pagan mystery practices. Serious academic work involves separating layers of tradition, distinguishing primitive material from later developments. But here's the crucial point. Even recognizing these complexities, these texts preserve the memory that early Christianity was much more diverse than we generally imagine, and that Jesus' teachings, including possibly teachings from the Last Supper, were transmitted in multiple traditions that were eventually suppressed. Comparative textual analyses reveal that certain themes appear consistently in apocryphal texts: emphasis on inner knowledge, importance of direct mystical experience, questioning of external religious hierarchies, inclusion of women in spiritual leadership roles. These themes also appear more subtly in the canonical Gospels, especially in John. This suggests that these ideas were not late inventions of heretical groups. They were part of Christianity from the beginning. And the Last Supper, as the culminating moment of Jesus' ministry, his last hours with the disciples, would be the natural context for teachings about these profound themes. Imagine, Jesus knows he's going to die. He's sharing his last words with those he loves. Would this be the moment for simple ritual formulas? Or would it be the moment to transmit profound wisdom, to spiritually prepare his followers for what's coming, to reveal mysteries he had kept guarded? Human and spiritual logic suggests the second option, and the apocryphal texts preserve the memory that yes, deeper things were said. Studies on the practices of communities that preserved these texts reveal that they conducted ritual meals where esoteric teachings were shared. These practices dated back, according to their own traditions, to the Last Supper. For these communities, the supper wasn't just about eating bread and drinking wine. It was about spiritual awakening, about gnosis, direct knowledge of the divine. Now, the established churches labeled this as heresy, and there were theological reasons for their concerns. Some Gnostic interpretations really did stray significantly from the Judaism of Jesus and early Christianity. But by completely rejecting these traditions, they also lost authentic elements that they preserved. The academic importance of these texts cannot be underestimated. They are windows into the diversity of early Christianity. They show that there was not a single version of what Jesus taught. Different communities, all claiming connection with the original teachings, preserved different memories. And when you realize this, when you comprehend that the Christianity we know is a result of selection, not complete preservation, an inevitable question arises: what was lost in this process? Specifically, what words from the Last Supper, words about spiritual equality, about direct access to the divine, about the role of women, about the mystical nature of union with Christ, were deliberately excluded because they threatened emerging power structures? The apocryphal texts don't give us definitive answers, but they give us clues, fragments, echoes of broader traditions that once existed, and these clues lead us to the next part of our investigation, the archaeological discoveries that brought these lost texts back to light. Because without 20th century archaeology, these silenced voices would have remained lost forever. December 1945. An Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman is digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. His shovel hits something hard. He discovers a large ceramic jar buried in the sand. He breaks the jar and finds 13 papyrus codices, ancient books, perfectly preserved by the desert's dry climate. What Muhammad found was nothing less than an entire library of early Christian texts, 52 different texts. Many of them were gospels and teachings that the world hadn't seen for more than 1,500 years. This discovery, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, completely changed our understanding of early Christianity. Suddenly, texts we knew only from hostile references by Orthodox leaders were available for direct reading. We could finally hear the voices that had been silenced. Scientific analyses dated these codices to the 4th century AD, although the texts they contain are probably translations or copies of much older originals, some possibly from the 1st or 2nd century. But why were these texts buried? The most accepted theory is that monks from a nearby monastery hid them when orders came from Christian authorities to destroy heretical texts. Instead of burning them, someone courageously preserved them, burying them in the desert, perhaps hoping for a future time when they could be read again. This wasn't the only significant archaeological discovery. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves near Qumran. Although these manuscripts are primarily Jewish texts, not Christian, they revolutionized our understanding of the Jewish context in which Jesus lived and taught. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed practices of a Jewish community that held communal ritual meals with profound spiritual significance. These practices provide context for understanding the Last Supper, not as something totally new, but as part of Jewish traditions of sacred meals that Jesus knew and participated in. Research on these discoveries shows that 1st century Judaism was much more diverse than we imagined. There were multiple sects, multiple interpretations of the Torah, multiple ritual practices. Jesus moved in this world of religious diversity, and his teachings were part of these complex conversations. Other ancient papyri discovered throughout the 20th century contain fragments of Christian texts. Some preserve slightly different versions of passages we know from the canonical Gospels. These textual variations show that even texts that were eventually included in the Bible existed in multiple versions in the early centuries. What does this mean for our understanding of the Last Supper? It means the account was not transmitted in a single, unaltered way. From the beginning, different communities remembered and recorded the event in slightly different ways. Discoveries at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt revealed thousands of papyrus fragments, including some of the oldest known Christian texts. Among them, fragments of non-canonical Gospels and Jesus sayings that don't appear in the Bible. Some of these fragments date to the 2nd century or even late 1st century. Paleographic analyses, the study of ancient writing, and radiocarbon tests provide reliable dating for these manuscripts. We're not talking about medieval forgeries. These are genuinely ancient documents that preserve early Christian traditions. Codicological studies, analysis of the physical construction of ancient books, reveal that these texts were valued. They were carefully copied, preserved in conditions that would extend their life, treated as sacred scriptures by the communities that possessed them. A fascinating aspect of these discoveries is that they frequently occurred in remote locations, deserts, caves, ancient garbage sites. Why? Because when texts were declared heretical, those who valued them had few options: destroy them as ordered or hide them. Many chose secret preservation, and thanks to that courage and the dry climate that preserved papyri that would normally deteriorate, we have access to voices that should have been silenced forever. Now, it's crucial to maintain academic perspective here. The fact that these texts are ancient doesn't automatically make them reliable as historical record. Texts need to be critically evaluated, regardless of when they were written. Antiquity is not equal to authenticity. But, and this is important, these texts demonstrate unequivocally that early Christianity was much more diverse than official narratives suggest, and that this diversity included different memories and interpretations of the Last Supper. Some communities emphasize the ritual aspect, bread and wine as sacrament. Others emphasize the communal aspect, sharing a meal as a symbol of equality. Still others emphasize the mystical aspect, communion as spiritual union with the divine. All these interpretations coexisted in the early centuries, all claimed connection with Jesus' original teachings. And archaeology proved that these different traditions really existed. They're not inventions of modern historians. What these discoveries teach us is humility. Humility to recognize that we don't have the complete picture, that gaps exist in our knowledge, that words were lost, and they teach us possibility. The possibility that profound teachings of Jesus, including words from the Last Supper, survived in fragments waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, integrated back into spiritual understanding. So, armed with this archaeological knowledge, with these rediscovered texts, we can now ask the central question: what words might Jesus have spoken that night that didn't reach us through the canonical Gospels? Now we come to the heart of our investigation. Based on everything we've explored, historical context, variations in the Gospels, oral traditions, apocryphal texts, archaeological discoveries, can we academically reconstruct what types of teachings Jesus may have shared at the Last Supper that were not preserved in the canonical accounts? Let's be clear from the start. We cannot know with certainty. We don't have recordings. We don't have living witnesses. What we have are clues, context, fragments of alternative traditions. But these clues are sufficient to make informed and academically responsible reconstructions. First, let's consider the Jewish cultural context. The Jewish Passover meal included specific moments for teaching. The leader of the supper answered questions, explained symbols, told stories of tradition. If Jesus was following this pattern, and everything indicates he was, then he would have spoken extensively about meanings, about history, about the future. Analyses of first-century Jewish liturgical practices suggest that discussions about liberation were central. Passover celebrated liberation from slavery in Egypt. Jesus, knowing he was about to die, almost certainly would have spoken about a new kind of liberation, spiritual, not just political. Apocryphal texts preserve memories of Jesus speaking about liberation from thought patterns, from fears, from material attachments. These teachings fit perfectly in the context of a Last Supper. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. These words recorded in John suggest a theme that was probably explored much more deeply. Second, let's consider the presence of women. Recent studies on early Christianity argue convincingly that women were an integral part of Jesus' movement. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, Mary, and Martha all are mentioned in the canonical Gospels as close followers. The absence of women in traditional representations of the Last Supper says more about later prejudices than about historical reality. If women were present, and evidence suggests they were, then words were spoken about their role, about spiritual equality, about leadership. The Gospel of Mary preserves a tradition where Peter questions why Jesus would reveal special teachings to a woman. The response of other disciples is essentially, if the Master considered her worthy, who are we to reject her? This type of discussion may very well have its roots in the Last Supper. Third, let's consider teachings about power and service. John records Jesus washing the disciples' feet during the supper, a radical act of humility and reversal of hierarchy. It's reasonable to suppose that this act was accompanied by extensive teachings about servant leadership versus dominating leadership. Texts that preserve emphasis on spiritual equality, on rejection of honorific titles, on criticism of hierarchical religious structures, probably reflect themes that Jesus addressed that night. You will not be like the leaders of nations who lord it over the people. Among you it will be different. Variations of these words appear in multiple texts. Fourth, let's consider mystical teachings about union with the divine. The long discourse in John 15 about the vine and the branches is explicitly mystical. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. This kind of language about intimate union with Christ appears in mystical Christian texts through the centuries. Traditions preserved in texts like the Gospel of Philip speak of the Eucharist as a means of mystical union, not just memorial. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. These words from John 6, though not from the Last Supper specifically, reflect a theme that was probably deepened during the supper. Fifth, let's consider teachings about the nature of the kingdom of God. Jesus spoke constantly about the kingdom during his ministry. At the Last Supper, knowing he would no longer be physically present, he would have explained how the kingdom would continue without him. Some traditions preserved in non-canonical texts speak of the kingdom as an interior reality, not exterior. The kingdom does not come with visible signs. No one will say, "Here it is," or "There it is," because the kingdom of God is within you. These words from Luke 17 suggest a teaching that was probably elaborated in the intimacy of the Last Supper. Sixth, let's consider teachings about suffering and transformation. Jesus knew he would suffer torture and death, but he also taught that suffering could be transformative. Words about finding meaning in pain, about not being overcome by evil, about love that transcends even death. These almost certainly were part of that night. Analyses of early Christian martyr literature show that the first martyrs faced death with extraordinary courage, often quoting Jesus' teachings that don't appear in the canonical Gospels. Where did these traditions come from? Possibly from teachings transmitted orally since the Last Supper. Seventh, let's consider teachings about community and unity. Jesus' prayer in John 17, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, is about profound unity, not just organizational. This theme of mystical unity was probably explored extensively. Texts that emphasize communities without rigid hierarchy, where the Spirit guides each person directly, may preserve memories of Jesus' vision for the future of his movement. A community based on love and equality, not on power and control. Eighth, let's consider teachings about discernment and inner wisdom. Jesus frequently spoke in parables, inviting listeners to think deeply, to discover hidden meanings. At the Last Supper with close disciples, he may have shared keys to interpretation, to deeper understanding. Gnostic traditions preserve emphasis on inner knowledge, on personal illumination. Although elements of these traditions are later developments, the core of the idea that each person can have direct access to divine truth is consistent with Jesus' teachings about the Spirit who will guide into all truth. Scholarly perspectives on historical reconstruction emphasize that we must be cautious. We cannot simply accept everything in apocryphal texts as authentic words of Jesus, but we can recognize that these texts preserve themes, emphases, directions of thought that probably have roots in the original teachings. What emerges when we gather all these clues is an image of a Last Supper much richer, deeper, more complex than the brief canonical accounts suggest. A night of hours of teaching, exploration of spiritual mysteries, preparation for the future, transmission of essential wisdom, words about equality that threatened hierarchies, words about direct experience of the divine that threatened religious intermediaries, words about inclusion that threatened exclusivity, words about radical love that threatened structures based on fear and control. These are the words that may have been erased, not by God, but by humans, not for lack of authenticity, but for excess of challenge to the status quo. Before continuing to explore the profound implications of these discoveries, I want to create a moment of global connection. Where are you watching this video from right now? Write in the comments your city and country. Let's show that this search for deeper spiritual truth has no borders, that in every corner of the world, people are rediscovering lost dimensions of Jesus' teachings. Together, we're participating in an awakening that transcends denominations, cultures, and continents. Now we need to look more closely at what was preserved, specifically the extensive discourse in John 13-17, because here, right in the middle of the canonical Bible, we have evidence that Jesus said much more at the Last Supper than the Synoptic Gospels record. John 13 begins with Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It's a deeply symbolic act. Washing feet was slaves' work. Jesus, the teacher, assumes the role of the lowest servant, and then he explains, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." This is a teaching about power turned upside down. In a world where leadership meant domination, Jesus presents leadership as service. And note, this isn't a quick statement. John dedicates an entire chapter to this episode and its associated teachings. John 14 continues with words about not having a troubled heart, about preparing a place in the Father's dwelling, about Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. And then comes a crucial promise. "I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. On that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you." This language is mystical. It's not about Jesus returning physically, but about a continuing spiritual presence. A union where boundaries between Jesus, Father, and believers dissolve. This type of teaching, about mystical union, is exactly what appears in non-canonical texts that were labeled heretical. John 15 presents the metaphor of the vine and the branches. "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit." Again, language of intimate union, of mutual dependence, of shared life. And then comes one of the clearest and most repeated commands. "This is my command, love one another as I have loved you." Jesus repeats this several times in the discourse. Love not as feeling, but as sacrificial action. Love that defines the Christian community. John 16 continues with teachings about the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, the Comforter. Jesus promises that this Spirit will guide into all truth, will reveal things that the disciples cannot yet bear to hear at that moment. This is a promise of continuing revelation, not fixed and unchanging doctrine. And then in John 17, we have what is called Jesus' high priestly prayer, a prayer for unity, not organizational unity, but mystical unity, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, so that they also may be in us. Now here's the crucial question. Why did John preserve all this while Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not? Why 5 entire chapters of teachings that don't appear in the other Gospels? Scholars offer various theories. Some suggest that John wrote for a community that emphasized mystical experience and deep theological reflection. Others propose that John had access to different oral traditions, preserved by different circles of disciples. A fascinating possibility is that John deliberately chose to record aspects of the Last Supper that were being lost or minimized. By the end of the 1st century, when John was probably written, Christianity was already becoming institutionalized. Perhaps John wanted to preserve more mystical, more intimate, more radical dimensions of Jesus' teachings that were being eclipsed by emerging hierarchical structures. Textual analyses of the Gospel of John reveal layers of editing. The text went through revisions, but the core of the farewell discourse is consistent in all ancient manuscripts. This means these words were valued, carefully preserved, considered authentic by Johannine communities. Comparisons with non-canonical texts show notable parallels: themes of mystical union, sacrificial love, inner knowledge, presence of the Spirit. These appear both in John and in texts like Thomas and Philip. This suggests they weren't inventions of heretical groups, but genuine themes of Jesus' teachings that some texts preserved better than others. What John shows us is that even within the approved canon, there's evidence that the Last Supper was much more than a brief ritual. It was a profound spiritual experience, a transmission of essential wisdom, a moment of extreme intimacy between teacher and disciples. And if John could dedicate 5 chapters to words from the Last Supper that the other evangelists didn't mention, what does that tell us about what even John may have left out? What else was said that night that no text preserved? The honest answer is, we don't know completely. But we know enough to recognize that the lost words were about themes that remain deeply relevant today: equality, direct access to the divine, inner transformation, radical love, authentic community. So what does it mean for your faith to discover that there are gaps in the records, that words were lost, traditions were silenced, teachings were marginalized? For some, this may be deeply disturbing. If the Bible doesn't contain everything, if human and political processes influenced what was preserved, how can we trust anything? This is a valid and understandable reaction, but there's another way to see this, a way that can actually deepen, not diminish, spiritual experience. First, recognizing the humanity in the process of text preservation doesn't need to eliminate the divine. Different Christian traditions have different theologies about Scripture. The Catholic tradition has always recognized the role of church tradition alongside Scriptures. The Orthodox tradition emphasizes the Church Fathers and ecumenical councils. Protestant traditions emphasize sola scriptura, but even within these traditions, there's recognition that understanding develops through Spirit-guided interpretation. What discoveries of lost texts do is invite theological humility, humility to recognize that no tradition has a complete monopoly on truth, that God may have spoken through multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple traditions. Second, the existence of lost words doesn't mean preserved words are less valuable. The core of the Christian message, love, sacrifice, hope, redemption, transformation, is clearly present in the canonical texts. Nobody needs apocryphal gospels to understand that Jesus taught radical love and justice for the marginalized. What additional texts do is enrich, add layers of depth, reveal dimensions that may have been minimized. They invite us to ask, what if there's more? And that question can be spiritually revitalizing. Third, discovering diversity in early Christianity can be liberating. Many Christians struggle with aspects of their traditions that seem inconsistent with Jesus' character as presented in the Gospels: rigid hierarchies, exclusion of women, dogmatism that punishes questioning, power structures that seem contrary to Jesus' teaching about service. Knowing that these structures weren't inevitable, that other paths existed in early Christianity, that other interpretations were valid before being suppressed, this can give permission to question, to seek expressions of faith more aligned with the Gospel's core. Perspectives from different Christian traditions on these themes vary widely. The Catholic Church maintains that its tradition and magisterium preserve authentic interpretation. Orthodox churches emphasize liturgical and conciliar continuity. Protestants emphasize return to Scriptures, though recognizing that interpretation always happens in communal context. But all these traditions, when honest, recognize historical development. Doctrines that didn't exist in the first century became central later. Practices changed, understandings evolved. This isn't necessarily betrayal of the original faith. It can be organic development guided by the Spirit. The challenge is discernment. What is legitimate development and what is deviation? What is growth in understanding and what is distortion by human interests? There's no easy answer, but the very question is important, and discovering that words were lost forces us to confront this question with renewed seriousness. Fourth, there's the question of spiritual authority. If sacred texts were selected by human processes, where does final authority reside? For some, the answer is in the institutional church. For others, in the canonical Scriptures. For still others, in personal experience of the divine. What study of lost texts suggests is that perhaps authority shouldn't reside in any external place, but in the combination of tradition, scripture, reason, and experience, what some theologians call the Wesleyan quadrilateral. No single element alone is sufficient, all balance each other. This is a more humble, more open, less dogmatic approach, and ironically it may be closer to the spirit of Jesus, who constantly challenged established religious authorities and invited people to think for themselves. Fifth, there's the practical question. How does this affect daily spiritual life? If words about equality, direct mystical experience, inclusion of women were minimized, what do we do with this knowledge? The answer is not to reject established Christian traditions, but to question aspects that seem inconsistent with the core of Jesus' teaching. It's to ask, does this practice or belief reflect radical love? Does it reflect humble service? Does it reflect inclusion of the marginalized? If not, perhaps it's time to reevaluate. Sixth, there's spiritual freedom in seeking. Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Seeking truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges what we've always believed, is an act of faith, not disbelief. The difference between faith and historical knowledge is important here. Faith is trust, commitment, openness to the transcendent. Historical knowledge is about what we can verify through evidence. The two don't need to conflict. Mature faith can embrace historical honesty without losing fundamental trust in God's goodness and love. Seventh, these discoveries can enrich spiritual experience. Knowing mystical traditions that emphasize direct union with the divine can open new dimensions of prayer and meditation. Knowing that women were leaders in early Christianity can liberate half the church to exercise gifts fully. Understanding that community was more important than hierarchy can transform how we do church today. Eighth, there's an invitation to respectful questioning. Respect for traditions, for canonical texts, for communities that preserved faith through centuries. But also courageous questioning. Did we lose something essential? Did emphases shift in ways that betrayed original intention? This balance, respect plus questioning, is difficult, but it's necessary for living, not fossilized faith. Finally, there's the question of how these discoveries affect interreligious dialogue. If Christianity is more diverse than we thought, if multiple interpretations were valid at the beginning, then perhaps we can be more humble in claims of absolute truth, more open to learning from other traditions, more willing to recognize that God may work through multiple paths. This isn't relativism, the belief that all truth is equally valid. It's epistemological humility, recognizing limits of our knowledge and openness to being corrected. The implications of these discoveries, then, are profound. They invite us to more mature, more questioning, more humble, more open faith. A faith that's not afraid of truth, because it trusts that supreme truth is love, and love has nothing to fear from honest investigation. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite all the variations in texts, despite all the words that may have been lost, despite all the human and imperfect processes of preservation, the central message survived. Regardless of which gospel you read, canonical or non-canonical, certain themes are inescapably consistent. First, love. Radical, sacrificial, transforming love. Love one another as I have loved you. This isn't an optional suggestion in any early Christian text. It's the central command, the definition of community, the mark of authenticity. Every text that preserves words from the Last Supper, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even fragments in non-canonical texts, emphasizes love. It may be expressed differently, but it's always central. Second, sacrifice. Jesus gives himself for others. This is the profound meaning of the bread and wine. Broken body, poured out blood. It's about self-giving, about putting others' needs before your own, about love that goes unto death. This theme appears consistently. It's not the invention of a specific tradition. It's the core of the message. Third, service. Jesus washes feet, assumes the servant's role, teaches that the greatest among you will be your servant. This completely inverts worldly notions of greatness and power. And here's what's notable. Even texts that were excluded from the Bible preserve this theme. Gnostic texts, despite their emphasis on knowledge, still emphasize humility. Texts that promote female leadership do so based on a model of service, not domination. The core remains intact. Fourth, remembrance. Do this in remembrance of me. The Last Supper is about remembering, not just historical facts, but Jesus' continuing presence through the community that shares bread and wine. Traditions vary in how they interpret the Eucharist. Catholics believe in real transubstantiation, Protestants in symbolic memorial, Orthodox in mystery that transcends rational explanation. But all agree, it's about remembering Jesus, making present his sacrifice, renewing commitment to his way. Fifth, communion. The very word communion means union, sharing, profound connection. The Last Supper creates community. It's not an individual act, but corporate. Texts that were preserved and texts that were excluded agree on this. Christianity is about relationship, with God, with others, with creation. Isolation is contrary to the gospel. Communion is essential. Sixth, transformation. Participating in the supper changes you. It doesn't just remember Jesus, but transforms you into his likeness. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. These words of Paul reflect the experience that the supper represents. Mystical traditions emphasize this explicitly. Sacramental traditions express it through liturgy. Evangelical traditions speak of new birth. Language differs, but reality is consistent. Encounter with Christ in the supper transforms. Seventh, hope. I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. The supper points to the future. It's not just about the past, memorial of death, or present, current communion, but also about the future, messianic banquet, fully realized kingdom, restoration of all things. This eschatological hope permeates early Christian texts. It's about confidence that history has direction, that evil won't have the last word, that redemption is certain. Comparative textual analyses show that these core themes appear even in texts that disagree about details. It's as if, no matter how divergent communities became in specific interpretations, they couldn't escape the core of what Jesus taught and represented. And this should give us confidence, not arrogant confidence that we know everything, but humble confidence that despite imperfect processes, despite lost words, despite human manipulation, the essential truth survived. The message of love survived. The model of service survived. The call to communion survived. The promise of transformation survived. The hope of redemption survived. Perhaps this itself is evidence of something divine at work, that despite every human attempt to control, distort, manipulate the message, the core continues to shine, like light that cannot be extinguished, like truth that cannot be completely suppressed. Mystical traditions through the centuries speak about how spiritual truth transcends words. That direct encounter with the divine goes beyond texts. That personal experience of God's transforming love is more fundamental than any doctrine. Perhaps that's what the Last Supper really represents. Not a set of words to memorize, but an experience to live. Not formulas to repeat, but reality to embody. The kingdom of God is within you. If this is true, and Jesus taught that it is, then the most important spiritual search is not discovering all the words that were spoken that night, but experiencing the reality those words pointed to. Communion with the divine, union with Christ, transformation into love, participation in the kingdom. These are not doctrines to defend, but realities to live. And perhaps, in the end, that's exactly what Jesus wanted. Not followers who memorize words perfectly, but disciples who live the way authentically. Not guardians of orthodoxy, but bearers of transforming love. This message survived, and it invites you now in this moment to respond. So we come to the end of this journey, a journey through centuries of history, through ancient manuscripts, through processes of selection and suppression, through archaeological rediscoveries, to this present moment where you and I are connected through this message. What have we discovered? That history is more complex than we were taught, that words were lost, traditions were silenced, teachings were marginalized. But we also discovered that the essential message survived: love, sacrifice, service, communion, transformation, hope. We discovered that seeking truth is not an act of disbelief, but of profound faith. That questioning is honoring the capacity for thought that God gave us. That honestly investigating history is respecting the complexity of human experience. And perhaps, most importantly, we discovered that you don't need to be afraid. Afraid that discovering historical truth will destroy your faith. Afraid that recognizing human processes in the Bible's formation eliminates the divine. Afraid that admitting gaps in knowledge means losing foundation. Mature faith is not afraid of truth. Because mature faith is not about having all the right answers. It's about trusting in God's fundamental goodness, about committing to the way of love, about openness to the Spirit who continues guiding into truth. The words that were erased from the Bible, about equality, about direct experience of the divine, about inclusion, about questioning hierarchies, didn't disappear completely. They echo through centuries in reform movements, in mystical traditions, in communities that insisted on Jesus's model over the model of power. And these words are available to you now, not in the sense of having the exact text Jesus spoke that may be lost forever, but in the sense of spirit, of direction, of core values that can be recovered. You can choose community over hierarchy. You can choose service over domination. You can choose inclusion over exclusion. You can choose direct spiritual experience over dependence on intermediaries. You can choose love over dogma. These choices honor what Jesus taught that last night with his disciples. They honor not just words that were preserved, but the spirit behind all words, preserved and lost. Recognition of historical complexity doesn't need to lead to cynicism. It can lead to humility. Humility is a profound spiritual virtue, recognizing limits of knowledge, being open to learning, willing to be corrected, capable of changing your mind when confronted with evidence. And humility opens the way to richer spiritual experience, because when you're not defending rigid doctrine, when you're not protecting absolute certainties, when you're not afraid of questioning, you're free to encounter God in new, deep, transforming ways. The Last Supper is not just a historical event 2,000 years ago. It's continuing reality. Every time communities gather to share bread and wine, every time people commit to the way of love and service, every time someone experiences mystical union with the divine, the Last Supper happens again, and the words, preserved or lost, become less important than the reality they point to. Reality of love that transcends death, of community that overcomes division, of hope that survives despair, of transformation that makes new creation possible. This is the message that no historical suppression could eliminate, no political process could completely distort, no institutional manipulation could totally destroy, because truth has its own power, love has its own power, and these powers are stronger than any human attempt to control them. So what do you do with this knowledge? With awareness that words were lost but essential message survived, with understanding that faith can be both intellectually honest and spiritually profound, you live. You live the way Jesus taught, not perfectly, nobody can, but authentically, courageously, with commitment to love that overcomes differences, with dedication to service that lifts up the marginalized, with openness to truth wherever it leads. And you join a community of seekers, not just people who accept ready-made answers, but who ask difficult questions, not just followers of blind tradition, but participants in living tradition that continues developing. This is the true heritage of the Last Supper, not a fixed set of words to repeat, but a living spirit to embody, not doctrine to defend, but love to live. And in that sense, Jesus' most important words at the Last Supper are not those written in any text, canonical or not. They're the words he writes in the heart of each person who chooses to follow his way. Words of unconditional love, of radical acceptance, of impossible forgiveness, of unshakable hope, of miraculous transformation. These words no one can erase, because they don't exist in ancient papyri or preserved codices. They exist in transformed lives, in loving communities, in acts of sacrifice, in moments of communion. And these words are being written now, in you, through your response to this call for deeper, more questioning, more courageous, more loving faith. The Last Supper continues. The words continue being spoken, not by a voice from 2,000 years ago, but by the Spirit who continues speaking, guiding, transforming. And you're invited to participate, not as an observer of ancient history, but as an active participant in continuing spiritual reality. This is the awakening to which you're called, awakening to complexity, to honesty, to humility, to love, to transformation. If this journey touched something deep in you, If you felt that these historical revelations connected with your spiritual search, don't let this moment pass. Subscribe to the channel now. Every video here is built with the same responsibility and depth you just experienced. This isn't just a community of viewers, but a global family of people who refuse to accept superficial answers, who value truth above comfort, who choose spiritual growth over doctrinal stagnation. And don't stop here. Click on the next video that will appear on your screen. Because the journey of knowledge doesn't end, it deepens. Each discovery leads to new questions. Each answer opens new mysteries. And together, you, me, thousands of others around the world, we're participating in something larger than any of us, a collective rediscovery of lost dimensions of spiritual truth. Thank you for watching until the end, until the next video.